Welcome! In this video we will look at embedding HTML within a form with the PowerBasic Windows Compiler. Now, to save a bit of time with this video, I've pre-built a form which we're going to embed our HTML on. This form is very simple. It has 3 buttons and 1 text box. The purpose of the text box is this is where the user can enter a URL for a web page, and then when they click on the display the HTML page button, it will pull down the HTML page and display it embedded in a browser within this dialog underneath here. The build a report button is the one I want to use to demonstrate that you can use this functionality to design an HTML page within your own program to display data, and then render it basically on this page inside the HTML object. And of course an exit button to exit the application. Now if we just add a label here to give the user some clue what we're actually doing here. Right, okay, having done that and saved it, we'll go back to the main program. Now, in the main program, I have included 3 additional libraries. The PB-HTML library, which I'll come back to in a moment, the PB Windows Controls, which is one we've done previously, and the PB File Handling Routines, which is also one we've done in a previous video. Now, in addition to that, we have the constants for the dialog itself and the calling of the form. Now, if we just run this program now, all we'll see on screen is the dialog. 2 buttons, an exit button, and a text box for the URL. Now, if we look at the libraries we're going to be adding, the PB-HTML library, which is new, will contain the code which is going to do the heavy lifting in this particular application. There are a couple of globals we're setting up. An object dispatch variable, which is basically going to be used to handle the web page, a Windows handle for the web control, and a dialog handle for the HTML object on the web page. It's important to note that there's a difference between Windows handles and dialog handles. A Windows handle is unique throughout all of Windows, whereas a dialog handle is all unique within that individual dialog. Now in this program I'm going to be making use of a Windows DLL, which is something we haven't done before, so I'll cover this in detail, by using the declare function. Declare functions where you're going to be using a function that exists outside of your application. In this case, we're referring to the function by this name. The library we're getting that function from is atl.dll, which is one of the Windows DLLs. Now, the function within that DLL, which is where the alias comes in, is actually called this. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the function name that you use. However, being a Windows DLL, this is case dependent. That's very important to actually note. So the function within the DLL is called this, but we could call it something entirely different. Now we're also creating our own function. This function is to initialize the object, and this function is basically to terminate our access to it. It's basically calling an unregister to unregister the class we've just set up, and it's passing it the module handle of the application we're currently running. If you use the get module handle API call with basically passing a null, it means we're talking about the application we're running at the moment. There's a third function, which again is coming from the same DLL, which is going to get as a control. It has 2 parameters, an input and an output. One is the handle to the window, that's the Windows handle, not the dialog handle, which is actually hosting the control. The output is the interface unknown of the control actually being hosted. We need that basically as an object. And further down here, these functions down here with one function and one subroutine. This function here is handling the interface, and this one is effectively making it a dispatch. These are functions specific to the HTML object. Now, if we go back to our code, and if we look at the PB main is doing nothing out of the ordinary. It's basically initializing the form. It's showing the dialog itself, the form on the screen. And if we go into the dialog, it's nothing particularly epic in here. Local variable for the handle, creating the dialog, adding the buttons, the text box, the third button, adding a label and setting the color of it. Now what we're going to do in here is we want to put some code in after PB Forms has finished doing its stuff, but before we show the dialog on the screen. Now we're going to display a HTML box on the screen. So we want to define where the box goes on the screen. So we need basically 4 variables. A variable for the height of the object, a variable for the width of the object, and 2 variables for the coordinates, starting from the top left hand corner, the X and Y coordinates are where you're going to place it on the screen. And then, in order to know exactly how wide and how tall the object is going to be on the screen, we need to find out how big the screen is in itself. Although effectively the screen size is hard-coded in here, location, width and height. This could change over time, and you could even have a case where the size is dynamic or resized by the user. So what we want to do in here is to get the size of the dialog. So the dialog gets size. We'll actually get his 2 coordinates, the width and the height, as 2 parameters. Now what we want to do underneath that is we want to work out where to start. So if we start our X coordinate at 10 dialog units in, and let's say we start the Y coordinate at 50 dialog units down from the top. Now we can work out the height. Now that should give us enough leeway on screen to fit the dialog in without overlapping any of the objects. Now, to place the dialog on screen, this is something that you want to have reusable code for, because you may be wanting to put this HTML dialog on many forms and many applications. So we're going to use a macro for this one. And macros, as I said before, are basically little chunks of code that when you compile your program, the compiler basically pastes this in for you. So it gives you all the advantages of having a function and none of the disadvantages. So we'll call that M for macro, prep HTML, and we want to give it some values. The dialog value, the X start, the Y start, the height, and the width. So that one line of code should put all the values in for us. So if we have a look in our HTML form, we'll see that I have prepared one of these earlier. Here's the name of our macro, mprep.html, and these are our values going in. Again, unlike functions, you don't have to actually say what type this is, because this is basically just a text replacement exercise the compiler does at runtime. So what we're doing, we're pasting in a number of dimensions of local variables. We're using an OCX name as an ASCII type string, 255 characters long. We've got a local height, width, start, X and Y. And what we're doing in here is we're populating this value with Shell Explorer, which is basically the name of the object we're going to throw onto the screen. And we're calling that function you saw earlier to initialize the object. And then we're setting the X, Y, height and width based on these values. I did some working out of the best values to use earlier on, but we're taking these entirely by what's been passed in. Now we're using the control add and the name of the class to actually add this control to the screen. And again, much the same as you would any other control, the name of the dialog we're adding to, the name of the Windows handle, the name of the dialog handle, the OCX name, which we've set up here, the X, Y, width and height, and a couple of properties to say it's visible, which is probably kind of useful, and it's a child of the dialog, and then we end the macro. So that gets all this extra information pasted in at compile time. Now, having put that dialog on the screen, we have to go into our event handler and do some event handling. Now, I've created a variable up here to take in the value of the text box. As you remember on the form, we have a text box where the URL is going to go. And we're going to populate that variable with whatever the user's put in there. So if we look down to our event handler for the buttons, we have the abort button, which closes the dialog. We have the OK button. Now the OK button in this case is going to populate the HTML. First thing it's going to do is it's going to get the text that is in that text box to the variable we set up. We'll double check to make sure there's actually something in this variable in case the user just pressed the button without populating it. And then we're going to call this new function to populate the HTML, passing it the dialog handle, the value that was in the text box, and the object, which is in fact the HTML object. Now, populate HTML is going to be a fairly generic routine, so I've placed that within the PB-HTML library. This is a very short function. Takes our 3 parameters in. Again, we're using the OCX name as an ASCII string. We've got 2 other values, one a dword, one a variant. We're using the control handle command. Now, what the control handle actually does, it converts the dialog handle to a Windows handle, because we have to use the Windows handle, which is unique to Windows, to pass to the function. This ATL-AX get control is a function within the Windows DLL. So we're passing it this handle, and we're passing it, coming back from that, this dword. And we're using the make dispatch, which is the other function, taking an output from this one, and passing back a variant, which we're going to be using to populate the OCX. Now in this case we use the variant to pick up the value of the strul, so basically that's turning the string into a variant, so we can use an object call to navigate to that particular page. So this is the equivalent in your browser of pressing the button to navigate to the page you want to go on. And then I've put in a dialog post command. We may not actually need one in this case because we're not actually resizing the control, but it's always a good one to have. Just in case the control actually has been resized. It calls the event, and if you need to put any code in the resize event of the dialog, you can put it in. So, what would that do if we ran it now? Let's try running it and see. So if we take a URL and paste this one in and hit the display HTML page, it will in fact go onto the internet, pull back the HTML and display it on our screen. Perfectly formatted, which is ideal. So that's the first bit done, which is fairly painless. These routines are all in the library, so they are quite reusable. So our next task is actually to put some of our own data from inside the program onto this. So what we want to do in that one, let's go back to our event handler. Now in here, where we've got the event handler for when you press the build a report button, what I'm going to do in this case is we're going to populate the str URL value with the name of a file that's local on the machine. Now I'm putting in exepath because that automatically picks up whatever path your program's currently in, and then we're tacking onto that string a report.html extension. Now ideally when you're doing this, we should probably point this towards the Windows temporary folder for this user, so that you're not always putting it into the folder where the executable sits, because after all the user may not have write permissions to that particular folder. But we'll cover that in a later one. This is just to prove the concept. So we have two functions we want to call in this one. One to actually build the report. This will actually build up of HTML, and one to populate it, which is the function we just looked at a moment ago. So once the report is built, we call the populate HTML with the pointer to the local HTML file, and it should display it. So all we have to do now is to build a report. And this is what we're going to do now. So for this one, we're going to be using one of the files we did in a previous video, which was the one we randomly generated, called mylargefile.txt. So we're going to reuse that from a previous video. So we need to set up some variables first. Right, these are our variables. One to contain the HTML content itself, one for the data we're going to be reading from our text file. str file name will contain the name of the text file. We want an array because I want to put everything that's in that file into an array, and I want to read through each row of the array and each column of the array. That's the string which will be a path to the input file. And this is the beginning of the content of the HTML. Just the tags to create HTML tag, body tag, and we're going to be putting a table in this particular case. So we're going to display all the information that's in that file in a nice little table. Now to do this, we're going to be populating it using one of the functions we've got in our library, which we prepared earlier, which is one of our file handling ones. Have a look at that. What we're after is, we're after this one that reads the file into an array. So that takes two parameters, the name of the file, and it wants an array into which it will actually put the data. So obviously if that file doesn't exist, then it won't do anything. So what we're doing in here, we've got to this point and we've actually got the data coming in, and we want to do a for next loop. Now this will read through every row in this array, and we're picking up one row and putting it into one variable. And we're using the HTML tag to begin a new row inside the table. And then for each column inside that row, we want to create basically a data element. We're using the parse count command to work out how many tabs there are in the row, so that tells us how many columns there are. So for each column, we start off with the beginning of a cell, which is TD, and we use the parse command to chop up the str data to find out which element we're actually putting into there. And we close the tag. Now that will continue until we've got all the rows in place, rather all the columns in place. And then just to make it slightly more readable, in case we have to look at the data, we will then close off the row and we'll put a cabbage run line feed at the end of that. Now once we get through all of the rows, we then want to close off the HTML page, closing off the table, closing off the body, and closing off the HTML tags. So str HTML should have everything that we need. Always good habit to put if you're using a function to return false so you don't actually find the thing you were looking for. So having got the HTML in place, we then want to push it out to a file. Now we've got another routine in our file handling routines, this fun append to file, which we're going to reuse. Now it will create a new file if it doesn't exist, or append to an existing one. So before we use this, we want to make very sure that the file we want to write to doesn't already exist. So we can preemptively kill it off. Which is we have an output file called str file, which that should be str file coming in, not URL. Let's call it str file because it's a file, it's strictly speaking not a URL. Right, first we want to kill the file off. And it doesn't matter if it errors or not. And we want to append there we go. And then we mark it as function true. So what this routine should do is it should build as a local report by looking at my large file.txt. It should, for each row in that, it should create a row and an HTML object and close it off at the end, closing off the table and firing that out to a file. Now, assuming we haven't made any syntax errors, which we haven't, what we should be able to do now is go back to our program. If we click the build a report button now, it does nothing. So okay, we've missed something. Let's double check. Right, I see the source of the problem. That should be along C. Right, if we try running that now, and hit build a report, there indeed is a report. So there we've taken our own raw text in a tab delimited file, we've turned it into an HTML object which is displaying on screen with its own scroll bar, nicely formatted without any problem. Now this is a fairly basic one. You could of course create an HTML file with colour, with italics, with bolding, even using a cascaded style sheet. But this shows actually putting an HTML file on your dialogues page is not difficult. Thank you for watching.